The Imperium Crown Hotel wasn't a building. It was a kingdom disguised as crystal and gold. And at its summit ruled Nikolai Sorin. He never raised his voice, never repeated an order, never forgave. He erased. That night, the corridors gleamed like polished bone. Diplomats laughed behind velvet doors. Guards stood like statues carved from violence. Lena Moreau wasn't supposed to be on that floor. She turned the corner too fast and collided with him. Her palm struck his chest. Crack. Immediately he slapped her. The sound cut through marble and chandeliers. Conversations died mid-breath. The guards moved instantly, hands near weapons, eyes waiting for blood. Nikolai looked down at her, the way men look at insects before crushing them. You don't touch me. Her cheek stung from the reflexive backhand. Heat spread across her skin, but her lungs forgot how to work. Apologize. Beg. Drop to your knees. Instead, she bowed, not in fear, in precision, and spoke softly in a dialect long buried beneath war and graves. Dom alumbre veci, yarta atingeremia. Forgive my touch, Lord of the Old Shadow. The air shifted. Nikolai froze. The guards glanced at one another. That language was dead. He had killed the last man who spoke it. He stepped closer. Too close. Say that again. She did. This time slower, deliberate. Something ancient flickered behind his eyes. Not anger. Memory. There had only been one man bold enough to address him like that. Adrian Moreau, the traitor. The man Nikolai had ordered executed, personally. Nikolai lowered himself to her level. His shadow swallowed her. Who taught you that? She lifted her eyes. They did not tremble. My father. A pause. The corridor felt smaller. The guards felt farther away. And your father is? Adrian Moreau. Silence. Not disbelief. Not fury. Recognition. Because Lena didn't resemble a stranger. She resembled a ghost. Nikolai Sorin had executed Adrian Moreau for betrayal. But if Adrian Moreau had been innocent, then Nikolai hadn't punished a traitor. He had murdered the only man who ever shielded him from becoming a monster. And now, the daughter of that man was standing in his fortress. Alive. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. And subscribe for more stories. Nikolai didn't shout. He dismissed the room. Leave. The guards vanished without question. The doors to the penthouse sealed with a soft mechanical click that sounded disturbingly final. Now it was just the two of them. The city shimmered beyond the glass walls, thousands of lights blinking like distant witnesses. Nikolai didn't look at her at first. He walked. Slow, controlled, precise. Each step deliberate across the polished stone floor. You understand, he said quietly, that claiming to be Adrian Moreau's daughter is not bravery. He stopped. It's suicide. Lena stood still. Her heart pounded so hard she felt it in her throat, but she refused to let it reach her face. There's proof, she said. He tilted his head slightly. Proof, he repeated. Adrian Moreau's body was burned. His accounts were seized. His bloodline erased from every registry I control. He stepped closer. I erased him. The words were not loud. They were factual. Lena's voice did not shake. You erased the man you were told he was. Something flickered in his eyes. Before he could respond, the private elevator chimed. Once. Soft. Wrong. Nikolai didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to. Only one man would enter without permission. The doors slid open. Raul Navarro stepped out as if walking onto a stage. Tailored charcoal suit, silver tie clip, expression carved from amusement. You dismissed the guards, Navarro observed lightly. That's rarely a good sign. His gaze shifted to Lena. He slowed. Interest sharpened. And who? He asked smoothly. So is this? He stepped toward her with casual confidence. Nikolai moved faster than Lena expected. His hand caught Navarro's wrist mid-air. The grip was immediate and punishing. Bone pressed against bone. Navarro's smile thinned, but didn't disappear. Careful, Navarro murmured. You'll make assumptions. Nikolai's voice dropped to something colder than threat. You walked into my private floor unannounced. Navarro's eyes slid back to Lena. And yet, he said softly, I think I arrived exactly when I was meant to. His gaze lingered on her face, not her beauty, her features, her structure, recognition forming. Then he spoke, in the old Carpathian dialect, fluent, precise. Umbra nu muore, se ascunde. The shadow does not die, it hides. Lena's blood turned to ice. Nikolai's grip tightened. This was no coincidence. Navarro held his gaze steadily, even as pressure built on his wrist. Adrian had a talent for hiding things, Navarro continued calmly. Documents, people, loyalties. Silence expanded between the three of them. Navarro leaned slightly closer to Lena. You have his eyes, he said quietly. That same inconvenient honesty. Nikolai released him abruptly. Navarro flexed his fingers once, rolling his wrist as if testing the damage. You should be careful, Nikolai, Navarro added. Resurrecting the past can destabilize the present. And you should leave, Nikolai replied. Navarro smiled fully now. Oh, I will. He stepped backward toward the elevator. But if ghosts are walking your halls, his eyes returned to Lena. You'll want to be sure they're yours. The doors closed. Silence, heavier this time. Lena exhaled slowly. That wasn't performance, she said. Nikolai didn't respond. He didn't just understand the dialect, she continued. He belongs to it. Now Nikolai looked at her, slowly. He was there the night your father died, Lena said. Nikolai's jaw tightened. That's impossible, he said. Is it? She held his gaze. My grandmother told me something before she passed. She said Adrian trusted two men. A pause. One betrayed him. Another pause. The other believed the betrayal. The implication settled like poison. Nikolai moved toward the bar but didn't pour anything. He stood there, hands resting on the marble. You are suggesting, he said carefully, that I executed an innocent man. I'm suggesting, Lena replied, that someone needed him dead. Nikolai turned back to her. If you are manipulating me, I'm not, she interrupted. There's a key. That caught him. In my apartment, hidden behind a false panel in my grandmother's wardrobe. She made me memorize where it was. For what? For the day someone else spoke the dialect. Silence. She said if that ever happened, Lena added quietly, it meant the wrong man survived. The room felt smaller. Nikolai walked toward her slowly, every step calculated. If this is a fabrication, he said, voice nearly a whisper, I won't strike you again. His eyes locked onto hers. I will remove you so completely that no memory of you remains. It wasn't anger. It was certainty. Lena swallowed. It's not a fabrication. A long pause stretched between them. Nikolai studied her face with unsettling intensity, searching for hesitation, micro-expressions, fear. He found fear, but not deceit. Finally, he nodded once. Decision made. Go and get your coat. They believed they were driving to retrieve proof, to unlock a hidden compartment, to expose a 20-year-old lie. What neither of them realized was that Raul Navarro had never come to interrupt. He had come to confirm. And the moment Lena opened that wardrobe, the man Nikolai buried would begin breathing again. But not in the way either of them expected. The hallway light flickered. That was the first sign. The second was the silence. Lena's apartment door stood slightly ajar, not kicked in, not splintered. Opened. Carefully. Nikolai didn't slow down, but something in him shifted. The air felt wrong, too still, like a held breath. Stay behind me, he said quietly. They stepped inside, furniture untouched, no overturned chairs, no shattered glass, which meant whoever had come wasn't searching. They were waiting. The first gunshot exploded through the window before Lena could process the thought. Glass detonated inward. Nikolai reacted on instinct, his arm wrapping around her, pulling her down as bullets shredded drywall above where her head had been seconds earlier. "Move!" he ordered. More shots, not wild, controlled, professional. Navarro hadn't sent amateurs. Nikolai didn't run for the elevator. He dragged her toward the stairwell. "Up," he said. "Why up?" she gasped. "Because down is predictable." Another shot tore through the stairwell door as they burst inside. Concrete chips sprayed across the steps. They climbed fast. 3 floors. 4. Boots pounding below them now. Navarro's men were moving. Efficient. Disciplined. Nikolai's breathing remained steady. Too steady. Another crack of gunfire. This one closer. He jerked slightly. Lena saw it. A dark bloom spreading along his side. "You've been hit." "Graze," he replied without looking at her. Blood still found its way between his fingers. They burst onto the rooftop. Cold night air slammed into them. Wind howled between buildings. Across the narrow alley, 6 feet of open space, another rooftop waited. 3 stories below. Concrete. No second chances. "Jump," Nikolai ordered. Lena stared at the gap. Her legs felt hollow. "I can't." "You can." Footsteps crashed through the rooftop door behind them. Heavy. Deliberate. Navarro's enforcer emerged holding a shotgun. Not rushed. Confident. He'd done this before. Nikolai stepped in front of Lena without hesitation. The shotgun roared. The impact was brutal. It drove Nikolai backward, the force slamming him to one knee. His armored vest absorbed most of it, but pain still ripped through him like fire. Before the enforcer could chamber another round, Nikolai fired twice. Clean. Precise. The man dropped. Silence returned, but only for a heartbeat. More footsteps below. "Jump!" Nikolai barked again. This time, Lena didn't argue. She ran. The edge came too fast. For a split second, there was nothing beneath her. Then impact. Her shoulder struck hard. She rolled, pain flaring down her arm. But she was alive. Nikolai followed without hesitation, even wounded. He landed heavier, grimacing as his ribs absorbed the shock. They didn't stop. They ran across rooftops, leaping gaps, ducking under ventilation units, cutting through access doors, until the sound of gunfire became distant echoes swallowed by the city. Only when they reached a narrow alley 3 blocks away did Nikolai finally slow. He braced one hand against the brick wall. Blood had soaked through his shirt now. "You need a hospital," Lena said. "I need answers," he replied. He looked at her. "The key is gone." It wasn't accusation. It was calculation. Lena bent down slowly, removed her shoe. From inside the hollowed heel, she pulled a small brass key, old, worn, unmistakably deliberate. She held it up between them. "I don't survive by trusting powerful men," she said evenly. Nikolai stared at the key, then at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, recognition. She hadn't come unprepared. She hadn't relied on him to protect her. She'd anticipated betrayal, just like he would have. "Navarro knew," Nikolai said quietly. "He didn't guess," Lena replied. "He confirmed." Which meant the trap hadn't been for the key. It had been for them, for proximity, for reaction. Nikolai straightened slowly despite the pain. "If Navarro wanted you dead," he said, "he wouldn't have sent shooters." Lena understood immediately. "He wanted you to see it," she said. "Yes." The ambush wasn't about elimination. It was about acceleration. Navarro wanted Nikolai destabilized, wounded, suspicious. And now he was. Nikolai looked down at the key again. "Where does it lead?" "A safety deposit box," Lena answered. "My grandmother paid for it in cash every year. She never told me what was inside." "And she trusted you with this?" "She trusted inevitability." A distant siren wailed somewhere in the city. Time was closing in. Nikolai stepped closer. "You understand what this means," he said. "If what's inside confirms your father was innocent..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Lena met his gaze. "Then you didn't execute a traitor." The alley felt colder. "You executed the wrong man." Silence. Heavy. Irreversible. Nikolai had built an empire on certainty, on precision, on eliminating doubt. If doubt entered now, at the foundation, everything could fracture. He reached for the key, but didn't take it. Not yet. Because once they opened that box, there would be no returning to the version of history he had lived with for 20 years. Inside that safety deposit box was proof powerful enough to destroy Raul Navarro. Proof of manipulation, of betrayal, of orchestration. But it would also confirm something far more dangerous. Nikolai Sorin had not eliminated a threat. He had eliminated the only man who had ever been loyal to him. And some mistakes don't weaken empires. They burn them from the inside out. The bank vault smelled like metal and silence. No windows, no clocks, no sound beyond the low mechanical hum of climate control protecting secrets worth killing for. Nikolai stood still as the safety deposit drawer slid open. Lena didn't touch anything at first. Inside were 3 leather-bound ledgers, a stack of sealed envelopes, 2 cassette tapes, and a thin folder marked only with a date from 20 years ago. Nikolai reached in first, not impatient, controlled. He opened the first ledger, columns of names, dates, transfers, payment routes disguised through shell foundations and humanitarian fronts. He turned another page and stopped. Raul Navarro, not once. Repeated. Over months, offshore accounts, government contacts, code names. Lena stepped closer. He kept records, she whispered. My father documented everything. Nikolai's face had gone unreadable. He opened the thin folder. Inside were photocopies of federal cooperation signatures, immunity drafts, preliminary agreements. Navarro's name appeared again, this time beside the insignia of a federal task force, confidential, unfiled, buried. Adrian Moreau had uncovered it. Navarro hadn't been consolidating power. He had been negotiating protection, trading names, trading operations, trading people, including Nikolai. Lena reached for one of the cassette tapes. My grandmother said he never trusted digital records. There was a small playback unit inside the box as well. Prepared, intentional. Nikolai pressed play. Static crackled. Then a voice. Adrian Moreau. Calm. Focused. If you are hearing this, it means Raul Navarro accelerated his timeline. I discovered communications between Navarro and federal authorities. He intends to dismantle the organization from inside, beginning with Nikolai Sorin. Silence filled the vault like pressure. On the recording, Adrian continued. I attempted to warn Nikolai. I fear he no longer trusts anyone enough to listen. Nikolai's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I will not confront Navarro publicly, the recording said. If I do, he will force Nikolai to choose, and Nikolai will choose stability. The tape hissed. Stability over truth. The audio clicked off. No one spoke. The hum of the vault returned. Lena didn't look at the evidence. She looked at Nikolai, watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, watched memory reconstruct itself. He remembered the night Adrian was detained, the accusations presented, the urgency, and Navarro advising swift action before federal exposure. He remembered not asking enough questions. He remembered the relief of decisive resolution. He remembered choosing the version of events that kept the empire intact. You didn't investigate, Lena said quietly. It wasn't accusation. It was surgical precision. You chose convenience. His eyes snapped toward her, cold, sharp. You're alive, he said evenly, because of my convenience. Meaning, if he had truly been ruthless, no bloodline would have survived. The tension between them shifted, no longer protector and protected, no longer predator and prey. Now, judge and judged. You executed the only man trying to protect you, Lena said. Nikolai stepped closer. You assume protection, he replied. I see unilateral decision-making, secrecy, withholding information. He was protecting you from Navarro. And in doing so, Nikolai said, voice low, he removed my ability to choose. Silence. Lena understood something then. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about control. Adrian had tried to shield Nikolai, but he had done it without trust, and Nikolai did not forgive being maneuvered. "You were afraid," she said. The words hung there, not shouted, not dramatic. Simple. Nikolai's expression hardened. Careful. "You were afraid," she repeated softly. "Not of the federal government, not of Navarro." She held his gaze. "Of instability." That struck, because it was true. Nikolai had built his empire on predictability. Structure, order. Navarro had presented chaos. Adrian had presented uncertainty. And uncertainty was a crack in the foundation. Nikolai closed the ledger slowly. "For 20 years, he said, almost to himself, Navarro has been positioning." "Waiting," Lena added. "Yes." The summit at the Imperium Crown was in 3 nights. Every major syndicate head, every political intermediary, every silent investor. If Navarro finalized federal protection, he wouldn't just dismantle Nikolai, he would replace him. "We expose him publicly," Lena said. "We release the recordings, the ledgers, the cooperation drafts." Nikolai looked at her as if she had suggested lighting a match in a gas-filled room. "No," she frowned. "No? We do not expose him first," Nikolai said calmly. "We make him afraid first." Lena studied him. Fear was not something Navarro experienced easily. Nikolai continued. "Navarro believes I am predictable, that I will protect structure over confrontation." He picked up the ledger again. "That assumption is the only leverage we have." "You're going to confront him privately?" "No." A faint shift in his tone. "I'm going to destabilize him." He stepped closer to Lena. "When a man believes he controls the narrative, you do not argue with him." His eyes darkened. "You remove his certainty." And when Nikolai Sorin decided to make someone afraid, he didn't bluff. He orchestrated, he dismantled, he erased. But this time, erasure would not be quiet. It would be theatrical, public, irreversible. Lena held the evidence in her hands, proof that her father had died for telling the truth, proof that the executioner had been wrong. And now she stood beside the man who had given the order, not as a servant, not as collateral, but as a witness, and possibly as his reckoning. The summit at the Imperium Crown would decide who ruled the city. Navarro believed he was walking in as heir apparent, untouchable, protected. But Lena Moreau would not enter through the service corridor. She would walk through the front doors, as the daughter of the man Nikolai had executed, and beside the executioner, who had finally chosen truth over stability. The private summit at the Imperium Crown was invitation only. No phones, no recording devices, no outsiders. Power did not announce itself here. It negotiated. A single obsidian table stretched across the penthouse conference hall. Around it sat the city's invisible architecture, syndicate heads, financiers, political intermediaries, men who never appeared in headlines, yet wrote them. At the head of the table sat Raul Navarro, relaxed, laughing, confident. He wore composure like armor. Nikolai entered last, measured, controlled. No sign of injury beneath the tailored suit that concealed bruised ribs and reinforced Kevlar. He took his seat without greeting. Navarro raised a glass slightly. "To stability," Navarro said smoothly. "May it always favor the prepared." Several men nodded. Then the doors opened again. Not dramatically, quietly, a service entrance. Lena walked in, still in her hotel uniform, black dress, white cuffs, hair pulled back, anonymous. She carried a polished silver serving dome on a tray. Some of the men barely glanced at her. Navarro did. Recognition flickered. Then amusement. "Well," he said lightly, "Nikolai, you always did appreciate symbolism." Lena approached the head of the table, placed the tray in front of Navarro. Her hands did not shake. Nikolai did not look at her. "Open it," Navarro said casually. Lena lifted the dome. Underneath, the leather-bound ledger, the cassette tapes, and beside them, a dead crow, its wings folded, its black eyes glassy. The room went still. Navarro's smile faltered, just slightly. Lena spoke. Not in the common language of business, in the old Carpathian dialect. Clear. Unflinching. The traitor who eats at every table eventually poisons himself. Several men at the table stiffened. They understood. Navarro stood abruptly, chair scraping against marble. "This is theatrics," he snapped. "Forgery. Desperation." But his voice had changed. Less silk, more steel. Nikolai leaned back slightly in his chair. "Play it," he said. One of the tapes was set into a portable player placed on the table. Static filled the room. Then Adrian Moreau's voice, calm, measured, detailed, outlining offshore transfers, federal cooperation drafts, Navarro's meetings, his intent to dismantle the organization piece by piece under protection. The room shifted. Eyes moved, not toward Nikolai, toward Navarro. "This proves nothing," Navarro cut in sharply. "You think the government doesn't fabricate leverage? You think recordings can't be edited?" Nikolai said nothing. He simply opened the ledger, turned it so the others could see. Names, dates, wire confirmations, cross-referenced, stamped. One of the older syndicate leaders leaned forward. He recognized his own alias on one page, and beside it, a transfer routed through an account Navarro controlled, without disclosure. Silence deepened. Navarro's composure fractured. "You're all fools if you believe this," he said, voice rising. "You think he won't turn on you next? He executed his own advisor without trial." That landed. Eyes flickered to Nikolai. Navarro seized it. "He kills to preserve power. That's what he does." For the first time, Nikolai spoke. "Yes." The room quieted. "I do." He looked directly at Navarro. "But I do not sell what is mine to outsiders." Navarro lunged suddenly across the table, not toward Nikolai, toward the ledger. Guards reacted instantly, weapons drawn. The room erupted into motion, chairs scraping, hands moving toward concealed firearms. Nikolai did not reach for his weapon. Instead, he stood, walked calmly to Lena, and placed a knife in her hand. Polished steel, balanced, sharp. "Your justice," he said quietly. The room froze. Every eye shifted to her. This was no performance, no symbolic gesture. This was a test. If she killed Navarro, she aligned herself with Nikolai completely. She became part of his method. If she hesitated, she revealed weakness in front of predators. Navarro laughed bitterly, though fear had begun to surface behind his eyes. "Go on," he said. "Prove you're your father's daughter." Lena stepped forward. The knife felt heavier than it should have. Navarro glared at her. "You think killing me fixes him?" Navarro hissed. "He still chose to execute your father." The words struck. Nikolai did not interrupt. He watched, not controlling, observing. Lena raised the blade. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then, she drove it down, not into flesh, into the oak table. The blade split the wood inches from Navarro's hand. The crack echoed through the room. "I'm not you," she said. Her voice was steady, controlled. "I will not become the weapon that created this." Silence followed. Different now. Heavier. The older syndicate leader spoke first. "Review the materials." The ledger passed hands. The tapes replayed. Questions sharpened. Navarro's denials grew less certain, less persuasive, because the numbers aligned, the dates matched, and the fear in his eyes betrayed him. Finally, two of the leaders stood. Navarro's own security detail hesitated, then stepped aside. He was dragged from the room. His protests turned to threats, then to shouting, then faded. The doors closed. No one asked what would happen next. They already knew. Navarro's screams did not last long. Inside the summit chamber, the balance of power recalibrated quietly. Nikolai turned to Lena. There was no smile, no approval, only acknowledgement. "You chose," he said. "Yes," she replied. "But not for you." Navarro was gone. His name would dissolve from ledgers, his alliances redistributed, his body unremarked. But Lena now understood something far more dangerous than Navarro's betrayal. Nikolai had hesitated before giving the execution order 20 years ago, just long enough to doubt, just long enough to question, which meant he had known there was a chance Adrian was innocent, and he had chosen stability anyway, and that truth could destroy him in a way no rival ever could. Later that night, the summit floor had been sanitized, Navarro's name already dissolving from conversation, but the rooftop remained untouched. Wind cut sharply across the skyline, dragging cold air between steel towers and glass. The city below pulsed in ignorance, traffic lights blinking, sirens distant, lives unfolding unaware that its architecture of power had shifted again. Nikolai Sorin stood near the edge. In his hand, a thin black file. He didn't turn when Lena stepped onto the rooftop. He knew it was her. "You could have killed him," he said quietly. She didn't answer. The wind tugged at her uniform. "You didn't." "I didn't need to," she replied. That hung between them. Not mercy. Not weakness. Control. He finally turned. "Your father left you $56 million, he said, extending the file slightly. "Diversified. Protected. Activated the moment Navarro was exposed." She barely reacted. Money no longer shocked her. "I don't want it." That surprised him. It showed, just barely, in the pause before he spoke. "You'd refuse power?" "I refuse blood," she answered. The wind sharpened. He studied her more carefully now. "Power," Nikolai said evenly, "is never clean." "And yet," she replied, stepping closer, "you built an empire pretending it was." That struck, not because it was loud, because it was precise. "You killed my father without proof," she said. There it was, not implied, not layered, direct. The truth neither of them had spoken plainly until now. The air felt thinner. "I executed him based on the intelligence presented to me," Nikolai said. "You trusted the wrong man." "Yes." He did not deflect. He did not argue. That, more than anything, unsettled her. "And now," she continued, "you want redemption through me." Silence. The wind carried it away across the skyline. He didn't deny it. "I don't believe in redemption," he said finally. "But you believe in balance." "Yes." She moved closer still, close enough that the distance between accusation and consequence felt fragile. "You could expose me," he said. "Yes." "And you don't." "No." "Why?" It wasn't defensive. It was genuinely curious. She looked out over the city lights, cars moving like veins of light through dark arteries. "Because if I destroy you," she said quietly, "the city fractures." She turned to him. "And when power fractures, blood fills the cracks." He watched her carefully. "I'm tired of blood," she added. That was the difference between them. He endured blood. She rejected it. "For 20 years, he said slowly, "I have ruled this city through certainty. And you were wrong." "Yes." The word landed heavier than any confession. "I built stability on a mistake," he continued, "on the execution of the only man who attempted to warn me." She didn't soften. "That mistake cost me a father." "Yes." Wind swept between them again. For the first time in years, Nikolai Sorin felt something unfamiliar. Not fear. Not guilt in the sentimental sense. Accountability. And accountability was dangerous, because it required change. "You touched me once," he said quietly, "and I struck you." She held his gaze. He stepped closer. Not dominating, not threatening, acknowledging. She lifted her hand slowly, placed it against his chest again, right over his heart. The same place, the same contact, but this time deliberate. "If you ever strike me again," she whispered, "I won't forgive you." No theatrics, no raised voice, just boundary. The kind he had never allowed anyone to set with him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he covered her hand with his own, not gently, but deliberately. Not possession, recognition. Below them, the city continued breathing, unaware that its ruler had just been judged and spared by the daughter of the man he executed. "You didn't take the money," he said. "No." "You didn't take revenge." "No." You didn't take my throne. She tilted her head slightly. You're not offering it. A faint shift at the corner of his mouth, almost a smile. Almost. I'm offering something more dangerous, he said. And that is? Influence without illusion. She studied him. You don't want forgiveness, she said. Same, no. You want oversight. Yes. Another dangerous truth, because oversight meant vulnerability, and vulnerability could dismantle empires faster than enemies. The wind howled harder now. The city lights shimmered below. Hard question, she said suddenly. He looked at her. If the roles were reversed, if my father had killed yours by mistake, would you have spared him? Silence. Long. Honest. Finally. No. That answer mattered, because it was real. She nodded slowly. Then understand this, she said. You were spared, not absolved. He accepted that. Empires weren't destroyed by enemies. They were destroyed by truth. And tonight, truth had walked onto a rooftop wearing a maid's uniform. Final question for you. If you were Lena, would you have exposed Nikolai and watched the city burn in chaos? Or spared him and carried the weight of his mistake with him? Drop your choice below, because power is easy. Justice is harder. And forgiveness? That might be the most dangerous decision of all. If this story pulled you in, hit like so I know to continue this series. Comment justice if you would have exposed him. Comment mercy if you would have spared him. And if you want more dark, psychological power stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next empire is already rising, and you won't want to miss who falls next.